Okay, let's continue in our discussion of supply and demand, and now we are going to address the issue of market equilibrium and how the market will work or strive to obtain equilibrium. In a free market, goods are allocated via the price system, that is, by the interaction of supply and demand, and this is typically demonstrated in the graph similar to the one that we just looked at, and it's in your notes. Now, the demand curve is downward sloping primarily due to diminishing marginal utility of consumption. The supply curve is upward sloping because producers focused on profits know that ceteris paribus, they make more profits selling at higher prices than at lower prices. Also, producers face increasing opportunity cost of production. That is, as they produce more and more goods, the marginal cost of production goes up. And so they will require higher prices in order to compel them or convince them to produce greater quantities of the good. All said, at higher prices, they are willing to offer more of the item for sale. Now, the point of intersection between these curves designates an equilibrium, price and quantity. What does this mean? It means there's no excess quantity demanded or quantity supplied. That is, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and the market is said to clear. This is what's called market equilibrium. I'd like to say there's no whining on the sidelines. In other words, there's nobody wanting to buy at that price, looking around for items, saying, man, I'd like to buy some more of this, but I can't find anybody willing to sell it to me at this price. Neither do you have someone wanting to sell more of that unit at that price who can't find a buyer. At that price, everybody who wants to buy at that price is able to do so, and everyone who wants to sell at that price is able to do so. So quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and the market is said to clear. Again, looking at this construct, we see this designated P star and Q star indicate the equilibrium price and quantity. But the market really only moves toward equilibrium as long as things are changing, which they constantly do. And of course, the sort of things that change have to do with cost of production, demand, changes in the items that influence demand. Well, we're about to get to those right now. Recall, first of all, we have to distinguish between movement along a curve and a movement of the curve, that is, a shift of the curve. We're going to movement along a curve is just a statement of the relationship between price and quantity given a particular set of circumstances. Movement of a curve results from a new set of circumstances and produces a new statement of the relationship between price and quantity, that is, a new supply curve. Now we're going to look at each of these possibilities individually and look at the causes of them that would result in changes in supply and demand. We're going to look first of all at the types of instances that might give rise to an increase in supply relative to demand, and then to a decrease in supply relative to demand, then an increase in demand relative to supply, and finally a decrease in demand relative to supply. First of all, increase in supply relative to demand. An increase in supply would be depicted as a rightward shift of the supply curve. And this could result from any number of items here. Better technology that would lead to greater productivity and lower costs, decreases in prices of inputs, increase in the number of sellers, the prospect for future prices to be lower than they are now, decreases in prices of alternative goods. In other words, almost anything that allows higher profits in the production and sales of that good in the present. Notice that when supply increases relative to demand, ceteris paribus, the price will fall and the quantity of the good bought and sold will increase. And we see, starting from our beginning point here, a rightward increase in the supply curve, or an increase in supply, would be depicted by this shift. Notice S1 was the supply curve. That is a statement of the relationships between various prices and the quantity of the good that suppliers would be willing to supply at those prices. And something has happened here, like those items that I just mentioned, that would cause an increase in supply. So again, notice it's depicted as a rightward shift in the supply curve, and notice the new point of intersection designated by P2 and Q2. P1 and Q1 were the original, that was the original equilibrium price, and with the rightward shift in the supply curve, now we see that the equilibrium price is lower than before, and the equilibrium quantity is higher than before. A rightward shift will result in lower price and higher quantity of the goods. Now let's look at a decrease in supply relative to demand. That will be depicted as a leftward shift in the supply curve. And that could result from, and if you look at this, you look at that list of things that would result in an increase in supply, and see this is just the flip side, the other side of those possibilities. Worse technology that would lead to higher production cost, increases in prices of inputs, decreases number of sellers, and so on. I encourage you to make those comparisons between the list provided under the prior scenario and this here. Bottom line, a decrease in supply relative to demand will result from anything that allows lower profits in the production and sale of the good. And that's going to be depicted by a leftward shift in the supply curve. As you see here, starting from S1, our original supply curve, a leftward shift results in a higher equilibrium price, P2, and a lower equilibrium quantity, Q2. Notice that when supply decreases relative to demand, ceteris paribus, the price will rise and the quantity of the good bought and sold will decrease. Now let's look at the third of our alternatives, an increase in demand relative to supply. Demand curves can shift as well, and I'm going to let you do a bit more work here in terms of figuring out, I say that, I'm not sure now looking at the notes and the PowerPoints whether I have you actually do that, but let's look at the possibility of an increase in demand relative to supply. Let's first of all note that an increase in demand will be depicted as a rightward shift of the demand curve, and this can result from these things we looked at on an earlier video and notes. Changed consumer taste in favor of this product or away from substitutes. Increased income, assuming the good is a normal good. Increases in the price of substitutes or decreases in the prices of complements. And increase in number of buyers. In other words, almost anything that causes consumers to want more of this good. When demand increases relative to supply, ceteris paribus, the price will rise and the quantity of the good bought and sold will rise. And there we see this increase in demand reflected through a rightward shift in the demand curve. Notice D1 defined an equilibrium price and quantity, P1 and Q1 respectively. And the new demand curve will now result in a higher equilibrium price, P2, and a higher equilibrium quantity, Q2. People want this item more, and they're willing to pay more, and you can see here that as a result, that increase in demand results in more goods being offered at a higher price. Now consider a relative decrease in demand depicted as a leftward shift of the demand curve. And this could result in, change consumer taste away from the product or toward competing products. Decreased income, assuming the good is normal. Decreases in the prices of substitutes or increases in the prices of complements, or decrease in number of buyers. In other words, almost anything that causes consumers to want less of this particular good. This is going to be, we're going to have a starting point again. There's our D1, our demand curve at the outset, and the equilibrium quantity, Q1, and price, P1. And a decrease in demand is going to be depicted how? That's right, by a leftward shift in the demand curve. And notice what happens here. We have a new equilibrium price and quantity designated as P2 and Q2. And the result is that fewer goods are offered and at a lower price. That's the effect of a decrease in demand. When demand decreases relative to supply, ceteris paribus, the price will fall and the quantity of the good bought and sold will fall. Well, what can prevent market prices from adjusting? Let's assume that changes in demand and changes in supply are occurring almost constantly. The market's always seeking to, let's say, pursue or to achieve equilibrium. But there are certain things that can get in the way of the market adjusting. Among these are laws and regulations such as rent controls or minimum wage, living wage regulations, laws to prevent price gouging, and usury laws. Unfortunately, since this is on video, I can't describe to you all of these situations that occur here. But what we would want to do is make sure you go to the textbook and look at the effects of rent control legislation and minimum wage regulation. Those two in particular are critical topics. In general, what you find is when the government intervenes to help, to assist people that, for instance, they think should earn more money or should be able to not have to pay as much rent, there is the law of unintended consequences to deal with. For instance, if the government says, we don't think that the market rate for unskilled labor is as high as it should be. And so instead of a minimum wage that at the market rate might be, let's say, $9 an hour in a given location, you may have new minimum wage regulations that say, no, it can be no less than $15 an hour. And in that case, what you generally find is that that price, if the legislated price is set above the market price, then you will find more people offering more suppliers of labor at that $15 rate than will be demanded, and you will actually have a surplus in the market. People will go out there looking for minimum wage jobs at $15 an hour, and they won't be able to find them. And as a matter of fact, what you find is there are fewer minimum wage jobs available with this legislation than after. In other words, some of those people will simply lose their jobs because businesses will not be able or willing to pay the higher minimum wage legislation or minimum wage rate. I'll see if I can develop something that might help you with that, Kylie and Jordan, but you really need to study that portion of the textbook on those particular topics so that you can understand the effects of the minimum wage legislation, basically the government intervention in the market. And that will take us to the next set of notes.